We're just a few days away from the start of COP21, the UN conference in Paris, where delegates from virtually every government in the world are due to finalise the first new global climate change accord in 18 years. The meeting will take place under the shadow of the terrorist attacks of November the 13th, and some experts, though by no means all, think this may have an impact on the outcome of the talks. But either way, huge questions remain about what a new climate deal might actually be able to achieve. I'm here with Martin Wolf, the FT's chief economics commentator, who's written extensively about climate change in the lead up to the Paris meeting. Martin, you've said that the Paris conference will in all likelihood not deliver a credible path away from the potential disaster of climate change, and the best we can hope for is that it will slow the pace at which we approach such a point. Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, there's history. We've had an enormous number of conferences, some of them very big and significant, Kyoto most notably in the early 90s, and actually emissions have pretty consistently risen. And of course, that means that the stock of greenhouse gases is rising at an accelerating rate. So we haven't succeeded. The second point is we are basically relying on national plans. The nations are going to make independent commitments. And if you add up all these commitments, at least so far, as I understand it, they don't add up to they don't give a restriction on emissions sufficient to deliver with plausible degree of confidence even the 2 degrees centigrade increase that climate scientists say is the reasonable limit, more likely well over 3. And finally, we can't have really strong confidence that they're even going to deliver on what they promise. People can promise they're not going to be binding commitments, there's not going to be any treaty, and even if there were, how do you enforce this? So if you add these 3 things together, I think it's pretty clear that we are not going to bring the emissions process under control here. We might, however, be at the beginning of a process that could lead to that, but that's for the optimistic future.
Now, a lot of people say that climate change is a sort of problem where it's very difficult to quantify exactly what sort of risks are going to be likely to be seen in the near future, and it would be foolish to spend a lot of public money trying to address it now. Now, you don't agree with that. Why not?
Well, I think the analysis is completely inappropriate. It is perfectly true that we can't define precisely the nature of the risks. There are huge uncertainties here. Unfortunately, the uncertainties range from relatively modest impacts to absolutely catastrophic ones. And it's not rational to risk catastrophe. In other words, something that's uncertain is not the same thing as something that's negligible. And the second big point here is it's very clear the processes involved are potentially irreversible. Because the greenhouse gases, particularly CO2, remains in the atmosphere for a very, very long time. Once it's up there, it's there. It will continue to have its effect over a long time. The result of that is the longer we delay, if it does turn out to be a serious problem, the more expensive, indeed potentially infinitely expensive, i.e. undoable, reversing it becomes. Now, if you've got this high degree of uncertainty and enormous costs, potential costs of delay, the right thing to do from an insurance point of view is to act now. I think the logic here is overwhelming.
Now, earlier this year, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, issued quite similar warnings, and he said there were potentially great risks associated with climate change, and for that he received quite a bit of flack. Do you think he was right to issue that warning?
Yes, I supported him in a column. I mean, he was fairly careful. I would even say very careful. He was saying, look, some of these risks are clearly financial. If we do nothing and it turns out to be a catastrophe, this will have a very large economic and financial effects. And business, investors and governmental authorities ought to take that into account. And then if it turns out that governments finally do decide, because it seems they're leaning towards it, to do something, that does look as though it means that a very large proportion of existing fossil fuel reserves and potential fossil fuel assets will never be used, will never be realized. They will be, in the common parlance nowadays, stranded. And that has implications for the valuation of companies, for appropriate investments, and therefore for the fiduciary responsibilities of pension fund trustees and other people that are responsible for investment. Simply simply on financial grounds.
Now, last year, interestingly, we saw that CO2 energy-related emissions stayed flat even though the global economy grew. If it were the case that we'd actually reached the point already where global emissions have peaked, would you change your view on the sorts of climate policies needed?
I would be very encouraged, because it might mean that it would be a little easier to get the targets about which I've been very, very pessimistic and indeed sceptical. But the truth is, as far as I can see, all the estimates show the same thing, that in order to bring the stock under control, limit it to the increase to, say, 450 or even 500 parts per million from where we are now, a little over 400, we actually have to reduce the emissions dramatically. So the crucial thing is stabilizing the emissions does not solve our problem.
So if there's one measure that you'd like to see in a Paris Climate Accord, should it emerge next month, what would it be?
Well, obviously, I'd love a global carbon price at a sensible level with a clear commitment to get it. But since I'm not going to get that, what I would like to see, which is a little outside the general framework, is, as I read it, is a massive effort at research. It seems to me the key solution here is going to be technological. It's crucial that we have alternative, credible technologies which can be rolled out, because if we don't, the poor countries of the world are going to go on using coal, and we're not going to solve the problem, whatever the developed countries do. So to me, the research effort is crucial. One other little thing, it's not that little, I know you've asked for one, fossil fuel subsidies are obviously really do need to be eliminated. And the IMF has done some very interesting work there. So these are things beyond getting the carbon price, which I won't get, which I would really like to see in this accord.
Martin, thank you very much.
Pleasure.